A tragic death under mysterious circumstances. 150 years later, the question remains, what really happened to Nina Craigmiles? Our story begins in the rolling foothills of Bradley County, Tennessee. This area was home to one of the wealthiest men in the entire state, John Craigmiles. Now, John was highly ambitious, to say the least, the type of man who would have been a billionaire even if he had lived today in modern times. He was highly educated, bold, calculating, and fearless in his pursuit of earthly riches. That's right. Wherever there was an opportunity to make a fortune, you could find John right there in the thick of it. During the 1850s, like so many others, Mr. Craigmiles caught gold fever and moved to California at the height of the gold rush. But while most men went completely broke panning for those shiny flakes, John took a completely different approach. He realized that the real money wasn't in gold. Instead, it was in the massive influx of men who were trying to get to California. You see, getting there was no easy task. The vast population of Americans during this era were on the eastern coast, and there was no train that ran across the country. So, anytime a fella got the itch to make the journey to California, he only had a couple of options. One, well, he could try his luck at the dangerous 6-month wagon ride across the nation through Indian lands. Or he could catch a ship and travel the Atlantic Ocean all the way around the South American continent and then travel the Pacific Ocean until finally, after 7 months at sea, he would arrive in California. It was here that John realized an incredible opportunity. What those 49ers needed was a shortcut, and that was in Central America. And by building a short 47-mile railroad across the narrowest section of Panama, a man could make the voyage to California in as little as 4 weeks. That's right. John operated 6 ships where he ran a non-stop ferry, transporting those eager gold seekers and supplies from Panama to San Francisco. And once those men were dropped off, John loaded the ship again, this time with poor souls who had lost their entire life savings, digging for gold, and he took them back to Panama where they could return to their farms in the eastern United States. It was genius, and John became filthy rich in the process. But after a few years, the Spanish sailors who were operating those ships finally rose up in mutiny and stole the vessels and disappeared. So, with his pockets full, John returned home to East Tennessee, where a new opportunity was waiting. This time, it was the Civil War. Now, lots of people don't realize it, but there were many men who profited from the war between the states, and John Craigmiles, he was one of them. Although he personally believed in the Union cause, he quickly signed up for the Confederate forces, and because of his vast experience in the transportation of goods, he was quickly made the chief commissionary agent for the East Tennessee Confederate Army. This meant that John was responsible for negotiating and purchasing all the food supplies from local farmers and distribute it to the soldiers on the front lines. And during this time, John made an absolute fortune. You see, the government gave John authority to pay those farmers 11 cents per pound for meat. But John, he only would pay the farmers 6 cents per pound and pocket the other 5 cents, keeping nearly 50% of the money for himself. And because he was a businessman at heart and wasn't exactly sure which side would eventually prevail in this bloody conflict, the last thing John wanted was paper money. After all, if the South lost, that paper money would be worthless. So for this reason, John insisted that all his payments be in pure gold. And by the end of the war, John Craigmiles was a millionaire. Well, anyhow, John eventually settled down in Cleveland, Tennessee, where he married a prominent woman named Adelia Thompson, who was the daughter of a wealthy doctor in town. And together, these two became a powerhouse couple. They were among the top 3 wealthiest families in the state and lived in a magnificent mansion in the center of town. Adelia was a world traveler who wore exotic rubies and diamonds and decorated the home with the finest furniture, art, and collectibles from her broad and extensive travels. Money? No, it was no object of concern. After all, John was now the president of the largest bank in the area, and he owned stock in 2 other banks. He had a massive portfolio of real estate holdings and even owned the public trolley system in town. Now, the couple rubbed elbows and were on a first-name basis with the wealthiest families in America. They gave generously to charity and were responsible for many of the buildings in the community. In fact, most folks said that it was John and Adelia Craigmiles who were responsible for building the town after the Civil War. Indeed, what a charmed life it was. John was the very picture of success. Yet, for all his earthly treasures, the one thing he didn't have was someone who could carry on his name, a child who he could mold in his own image, and one day leave his estate to. This was the one thing his heart desired the most, and in 1864, Adelia gave John his wish when she gave birth to a baby girl named Nina. Oh, what a beautiful child she was. The spitting image of her mother, with bright eyes, delicate features, and a smile that could soften even the hardest heart. John loved that little girl like he had never loved anything else in this world. From the moment Nina was placed in his arm, all the gold, the property, suddenly seemed to pale in comparison. She became the center of his life, and there was never a thing that her young heart desired that her father wouldn't provide. She wore the finest dresses money could buy, played with beautiful dolls that were brought home from distant countries, and grew up surrounded by every comfort imaginable. But despite all the wealth and privilege, Nina wasn't a spoiled child. The truth is, there was something special about her. Nearly everyone who knew her loved her. She was outgoing, affectionate, and possessed the kind of gentle spirit that naturally drew people towards her. Nearly everyone in Cleveland knew the young girl and would stop to speak with her as she walked to and from school or played with her friends beneath the shade trees in the park. And since her grandparents lived nearby, Nina spent many afternoons picking flowers in her grandma's garden, gathering the prettiest blossoms in her bucket that she would proudly carry home and make into bracelets and necklaces for her mama. But more than anything, she loved riding beside her grandfather in his horse-drawn buggy as he made house calls throughout the countryside, delivering medicine and comfort to the sick. Storekeepers would step in their doorways and wave, and neighbors would call the young girl's name from their porches as the buggy passed by, and Nina would smile and wave back to every one of them. She was the beloved child of the entire community, and to those who watched her growing beneath the protection of one of Tennessee's wealthiest families, it must have seemed that Nina Craigmiles had been born beneath a lucky star and was destined to become one of the most sought-after Southern belles in American history. Yet, it's here that our story takes a tragic turn. You see, neither money nor influence can bargain with fate. And although John and Adelia didn't know it, the happiness that they had worked so hard to build was about to be swept away in a horrifying instant and would become one of the greatest mysteries in American history.
Give someone you love the gift of old-fashioned storytelling. 5 books for the young and old alike that will make your heart smile. Click the link below to order your copy of the Appalachian Storyteller today, also available on Amazon.
By the fall of 1871, Nina Craigmiles was 7 years old, a beautiful young girl with a promising life ahead of her. No one would have suspected the tragedy that lurked in the mist. It occurred on St. Luke's Day, October 18th. Nina had spent the morning picking a basket full of flowers alongside her granny, and after lunch, the young girl climbed into the buggy alongside her grandpa as the two prepared to make the rounds, visiting his medical patients. Now, Dr. Thomas's buggy was pulled by a single mule, and over the next couple hours, the good doctor and his favorite granddaughter went about their business without a care in the world. Now, I need to pause here for just a moment and remind you that this is a true story. And what happens next has been a mystery for the past 150 years, as historians and researchers have proposed theories about what could have possibly led to this deadly accident. Some say that Nina loved to go fast and her grandpa would allow her to hold the reins. Others say that it was a storm that blew in and a terrible lightning strike spooked the mule and caused him to run out of control, while others speculate that the doctor might have been drinking that day. But whatever the case was, Dr. Thomas and Nina were crossing the tracks on their way home when their buggy was struck by a train. The impact threw the doctor from the vehicle, but sadly, the buggy was crushed and Nina was swept underneath the cow catcher of the locomotive and was killed in an unspeakable tragedy. The accident had happened right in the center of town, and within minutes, the entire community was on the scene. It truly was the most tragic, heartbreaking event anyone had ever seen, as all the pages in Nina's book of life were ripped out in an instant. And while everyone who loved her was heartbroken, for John Craigmiles, he was inconsolable and would never be the same. All the money in the world couldn't bring his baby girl back. News of the child's death made newspapers all across East Tennessee, and the entire community grieved for weeks. But for John, no matter how much time went by, his heart never recovered. It was then that he decided to build a legacy and a memorial for his daughter in a way that no one had seen before. Something that would ensure that Nina would never be forgotten. And he would build it on the very spot that Nina had spent so many days playing with her friends and picking flowers with her grandma. First, John started a world-class school that was exclusively for girls. Then, John hired the finest architects and craftsmen in America to build a beautiful Victorian Gothic church that would be named St. Luke's, since that was the day his daughter died. Then, John imported the finest marble from Italy, 2 train cars full, and built a beautiful mausoleum that resembled a Victorian castle with walls 4 feet thick, and in the center of it was a stunning hand-carved marble crypt. And there, Nina Craigmiles' earthly remains were laid to rest. Altogether, John spent a fortune on the church and the mausoleum. But no sooner than it was completed, a series of strange, bad omens began to happen. You see, Mr. Craigmiles had hired an Italian sculptor to create a life-size marble statue of Nina that would be displayed in the church. However, when the statue was finished and loaded onto a cargo ship, it promptly set sail across the Atlantic Ocean. But strangely, a sudden storm overtook the vessel, which sank, and left Nina's statue in a watery grave buried at the bottom of the sea. John and Adelia had another child, this time a son, but he only lived a few hours and never even had a name. The couple buried him in a vault inside of Nina's stone castle. And then, for some unexplained reason, the stones in the archway over the entrance to the mausoleum began to turn red. John promptly paid to have the stones cleaned, over and over, but each time the stones would turn red again. Many locals believed it was blood, and others swore that they heard a child crying inside of the stone castle. And as for John, a few years later, as he was walking to the bank on a wintry morning, he slipped and fell on an icy patch and cut his hand. At first, he didn't pay much mind to it, but by the next day, the hand had swollen terribly. And by the third day, John was overtaken by a fever and found himself on his deathbed with blood poisoning. Adelia was devastated. As John made out his last living will, she swore to him that she would never remarry, and John even wrote in his will that after he was entombed beside his daughter, that his wife would be the only other person allowed to be placed inside the mausoleum. When John Craigmiles died, he was worth at least $20 million, which his loving wife assumed control over. But as far as her promise to John that she would never remarry, well, that would be a promise that she wouldn't keep for long. Besides, any woman who was a world traveler and wined and dined with the elite was bound to be in contact with many men, and before long, a young and dashing fella who was 20 years younger than her swept her off her feet, and she did, in fact, get married again. But she was no fool, and she only did so with a prenup, so that young, handsome new husband would never control her money. And when the day came that her second husband died, Adelia did something that I'm sure would have made John roll over in his grave. When Adelia buried her second husband inside the mausoleum beside Nina and John. And as for Adelia, well, she would live to the ripe old age of 86 years, when one beautiful day in 1928, she was walking across the street and was ran over by an automobile and killed. In her will, she instructed that she be the last person buried in the family mausoleum, not as the wife of John, but as the mother of Nina Craigmiles. When Adelia died in 1928, there were no heirs to leave the family fortune to, so it was donated to various charities, with much of it being left to the church that John had built in Nina's memory. Just like that, the earthly empire that John Craigmiles built was completely gone. You know, as I researched this story, I couldn't help but to go back to two details that remained a mystery. First, how exactly did Nina die? Was it possible for me to research some local archive? I mean, it had been 150 years, but surely someone had written something down somewhere. The other one was the red stains on the monument. What were they? Were they still there? I had to know for myself, so I set out, bound for Cleveland, Tennessee. Well, guys, here we are. We are at St. Luke's Church here in Cleveland, Tennessee, right in the heart of Cleveland, Tennessee. When this was built 150 years ago, this was literally the center of the town, and in many ways it still is. It's absolutely incredible how this has stood the test of time. The church is unaltered. The mausoleum is unaltered. Look how incredible that is. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that this actually was Nina's grandfather's yard. And Nina played here. Her grandmother had a big flower garden here, and this is where Nina would play. And her grandfather was so devastated by the accident, which literally took place less than a mile over here where the railroad tracks still run today. He was so devastated that he donated all of this land. He would literally be in his living room and he would see this mausoleum with his granddaughter in it. You know, and speaking of her grandfather, he never was the same after Nina's death. And in fact, he only lived another year and died. 4 foot thick walls. Can you imagine that? 4 feet thick. Now, I've been holding off on talking about this one part here. But first, let me just kind of, I guess, give you an introduction to this. So, you know, anytime something tragic like this happens and then years go by, people start to make spooky legends and things like this out of it. And for years, locals who lived here, locals have stated that this place is haunted. Some people claim that they can still see Nina playing out here in her garden right here, which still bears the stone that was put out here by her family 150 years ago. Let's take a look at this. But people claim they can still see her out here. Nina's little garden. Wow. And they have a playground here, and a lot of the kids will say that they hear a little girl here. And some people have claimed that they see her grandmother here. Remember, this is where her grandmother and her would pick flowers and spend all kinds of time together. And when John imported all of this marble and put it together, and it was finally time to lay his daughter's remains inside, no sooner than he put it in, it started turning blood red. And here's what I mean. I'm gonna see if I can get up here. You can see right here the red stains. Also, right here. Now they tried and tried to clean that many times, and they never could. It just kept coming back. And so a lot of people, the legend started that it was blood. And look at this door. Right inside of it, it says Nina, and it has the date she died. And this mausoleum is actually opened one time a year. Every Easter, they open the door, and all the children here in Cleveland, Tennessee, and they place flowers on the marble crypt inside that contains Nina's remains. That tradition actually started when Nina died, because all of her classmates came and picked flowers from her grandmother's garden. As I stood at that mausoleum, I couldn't help but to think about John Craigmiles' life and even his death. It just doesn't sit right with me at all that his wife buried her second husband next to him and his daughter. It bothered me deep down to my core. But maybe that was just me. How do you feel about it? What do you think? And as for the real cause of Nina's death, well, I spent the afternoon at the East Tennessee History Museum studying their microfilm collection from the 1870s, and I found the answer that I know without a shadow of a doubt is the real reason for her death. It was from a Knoxville newspaper that was printed the morning after Nina's death, less than 12 hours later. I'd like to read it for you now. A sad accident occurred about 4 o'clock this afternoon on the railroad crossing near the depot. Dr. Thomas was in a buggy with his granddaughter, Nina, 7 years old, a daughter and only child of John H. Craigmiles of this place. In attempting to cross the railroad track, the mule attached to the buggy became obstinate and refused to move. At this moment, the buggy was run into by an engine which was switching in the yard. Nina Craigmiles was instantly killed by falling from the buggy, which was crushed into pieces. When Dr. Thompson was picked up, he could only cry, "Oh, the child, the child." The doctor is now walking about. I cannot say whether he is injured or not. He is terribly shocked by the death of the child, who had appealed to him to desist in the attempt to cross the track. She, it is supposed, saw the engine approaching and realized their perilous situation, but it seems she failed in impressing it upon the mind of her grandfather, who now, when asked if he is hurt, gives but one response: "Oh, the child, the child." So there you go, the truth of how Nina really died. And finally, what about those red stains on the stone? Now, I have my thoughts on exactly what they are and how they got there, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. What do you think they are? I look forward to reading your comments below. Thanks so much for watching this episode, and as always, be sure to like and subscribe for more true stories from Appalachia's past.